Heading: A Strange Awakening. The first thing Jaren felt was a pounding headache, as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to his skull. The second was the unfamiliar softness beneath his back, definitely not the hard bunk of his military transport ship. His eyelids fluttered open, then immediately squeezed shut against the bright, artificial light flooding his vision. "What the hell?" he muttered, raising a hand to shield his eyes. As his vision adjusted, Jaren realized he was lying on a bed in what appeared to be a dormitory room. The walls were a pristine white, with strange, flowing script etched into them that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Various objects floated on anti-gravity shelves, books, strange devices, and what looked like plants from a dozen different worlds. Jaren tried to sit up, only to discover he was wearing nothing but dark blue briefs. His muscular torso was completely exposed, and there was no sign of his uniform anywhere. Panic began to rise in his chest as fragmented memories surfaced, the mission, the unexpected anomaly, the blinding flash of light, and then, nothing. Heading: The Mysterious Girl. Finally awake? A soft, melodic voice asked from somewhere to his right. Jaren whipped his head around so fast he nearly gave himself whiplash. Sitting at the foot of his bed, one leg tucked beneath her, was quite possibly the most striking woman he'd ever seen, if she was human, which she clearly wasn't. Her skin was a vibrant, luminous red that seemed to glow under the room's lighting. Long, silvery white hair cascaded down her back and over her shoulders like liquid moonlight. Her eyes were large, almond-shaped, and a startling violet color with no visible pupils. She wore a tight, matte black bodysuit that left her shoulders, legs, and a generous portion of her chest exposed, accentuating a figure that would make supermodels weep with envy. But what struck Jaren most was the expression on her face, pure, undiluted scientific curiosity, as if he were a particularly fascinating specimen under a microscope. "Who the hell are you?" Jaren demanded, scrambling backward until his back hit the wall. "Where am I? What happened to my ship?" The alien woman tilted her head, those violet eyes studying him with increased interest. "Your speech patterns matched the linguistic database perfectly," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She leaned forward, close enough that Jaren could smell something like cinnamon and ozone emanating from her. "I've never seen a living human this close before." Her slender fingers reached out, and before Jaren could react, she was tracing the contours of his face with a touch so light it was barely perceptible. "Stop that." Jaren batted her hand away, his military training kicking in as he assessed potential escape routes. The room had one door and what appeared to be a large window overlooking, holy hell, was that a space station? The red-skinned woman didn't seem offended by his reaction. If anything, she looked even more intrigued. Fascinating. Defensive response. Is this typical human behavior when confronted with the unknown? "Lady, you've got about 5 seconds to tell me where I am before I..." "Before you what?" she smiled, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp to be human. "You're currently in my dormitory at the Galactic Confluence University, specifically the Xenobiology wing. And you, Jaren Holt, are the subject of my graduation research project." Heading: The Truth Revealed. Jaren froze. "How do you know my name?" "Your identification tags," she replied, gesturing to a small table where his dog tags lay. "I'm Lyra, by the way. Lyra Valen, 4th-year Xenobiology student, specializing in emergent sentient species." She extended a hand in what was clearly an attempt to mimic a human greeting. "Your species' custom is to shake hands, correct?" Jaren ignored the offered hand. "How did I get here? Last thing I remember, I was on a recon mission near the Arcturus sector." Lyra's expression shifted to something that might have been guilt. "Ah, yes, about that. Your vessel encountered one of our university's research probes. It seems the automated defense systems interpreted your approach as hostile and, well, teleported you here." "Teleported?" Jaren repeated incredulously. That's impossible. We don't have that technology. You don't, Lyra agreed cheerfully. We do, though. I should clarify, only you were teleported. Your vessel and crew continued on their way, likely assuming you were killed in what they would perceive as a minor explosion. The implications hit Jaren like a punch to the gut. His crew would report him as Kia. No one would be looking for him. He was effectively stranded in what appeared to be an alien university, wearing nothing but his underwear, being studied by a beautiful red-skinned woman who looked at him like he was an interesting bug. Me, he groaned, running a hand through his short brown hair. Lyra's eyes widened. Is that an invitation or an expression of dismay? The database is unclear on the contextual usage. Despite everything, Jaren couldn't help but let out a bark of laughter. Expression of dismay. Definitely. He took a deep breath, his military training kicking in. Assess the situation. Adapt. Survive. So, I'm your lab rat now? Oh, nothing so crude, Lyra assured him, looking mildly offended. You're a research subject, yes, but with full autonomy and rights. The ethics committee would have my head otherwise. She paused, then added with a hint of pride, you're actually the first human to ever set foot on our campus, you know. We've observed your species from afar for centuries, but direct contact has been limited. Limited? Jaren repeated flatly. And why is that? Lyra's expression turned diplomatic. Let's just say your species has a reputation for being somewhat volatile when encountering new civilizations. That's rich, coming from someone who just kidnapped me. Not kidnapped, Lyra corrected quickly. Rescued. The probe's defensive measures would have vaporized you otherwise. The teleportation was a failsafe. Jaren wasn't buying it, but arguing wouldn't get him anywhere. He needed information, and this Lyra seemed willing to talk. So, what happens now? He asked cautiously, relaxing his defensive posture. Lyra brightened immediately. Now, you help me complete my thesis on human adaptability in non-terrestrial social structures. In return, you'll be given accommodation, sustenance, and, eventually, once my research is complete, we can discuss returning to your people. She clapped her hands together. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Sounds like I don't have much choice, Jaren muttered. There's always a choice, Lyra said, suddenly serious. If you truly wish to leave, arrangements can be made. But I should warn you, the bureaucracy involved would take approximately one standard solar cycle, and in the meantime, you'd be placed in quarantine rather than allowed to freely experience our campus. Jaren weighed his options, quarantine in some alien facility versus playing along with this bizarre research project. At least the latter would give him freedom to move, gather information, maybe even find a way home on his own terms. Fine, he said finally. I'll help with your research. But I want clothes, information, and some goddamn privacy. Lyra's face lit up with genuine delight. Excellent. I've already prepared appropriate attire based on human physiological requirements. She bounded off the bed with inhuman grace and retrieved a stack of clothing from a nearby drawer. These should fit. The fabric adapts to body temperature and environmental conditions. Jaren accepted the clothes, a simple black shirt and pants that felt like some kind of synthetic material, along with boots that looked surprisingly similar to his military-issue ones. I'll give you privacy to change, Lyra said, moving toward the door. When you're ready, I'll show you around the campus and explain everything in more detail. She paused at the threshold. And, Jaren? Thank you. This opportunity means more to me than you can imagine. As the door closed behind her, Jaren sat on the edge of the bed, clothes in hand, trying to process the absurdity of his situation. Stranded on an alien campus, research subject for a beautiful red-skinned woman who seemed equal parts brilliant and naive. Well, he muttered to himself as he pulled on the shirt, at least it beats being vaporized. Heading: A New World Unveiled. Jaren stepped out of the dormitory, now dressed in the adaptive clothing Lyra had provided. The fabric felt oddly responsive against his skin, subtly adjusting to his body temperature as he moved. Lyra was waiting for him in the corridor, her silver hair shimmering under the soft glow of the overhead lights. "Ready for the grand tour?" she asked, her violet eyes sparkling with excitement. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jaren replied, still trying to wrap his head around his bizarre situation. "Lead the way, Professor." Lyra laughed, a melodic sound that reminded Jaren of wind chimes. "I'm not a professor yet, just a senior student. But with your help, that title might not be far off." She guided him down a corridor that seemed to shift subtly as they walked. The walls occasionally became transparent, revealing breathtaking views of space. Jaren couldn't help but stare at the massive structure extending outward in all directions, a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings, domes, and garden spaces suspended in the void. "Welcome to Galactic Confluence University," Lyra announced proudly. "The premier educational institution in the 7 systems, home to over 300 species and 12,000 students." Heading: A Melting Pot of Species. As they entered what appeared to be a central atrium, Jaren froze. The space was teeming with alien life. Beings of every conceivable shape, size, and color moved through the area with purpose. Some appeared vaguely humanoid, while others defied categorization entirely. Floating orbs of light conversed with tentacled creatures, tall, willowy beings with iridescent skin browsed holographic displays, and squat, armored individuals that reminded Jaren of walking tanks. "Holy hell," he breathed, unconsciously moving closer to Lyra. "Overwhelming, isn't it?" she said sympathetically. "Don't worry, most species here have never seen a human before, but they're generally respectful of biological diversity." "Generally?" Jaren questioned, noticing several curious stares already directed his way. "Well, there are always exceptions," Lyra admitted. "Which brings me to something important you should know." She guided him to a quieter alcove, her expression turning serious. "Humans are classified as a protected species under galactic concordant regulations." "Protected? What does that mean, exactly?" "It means Earth is essentially considered a wildlife preserve," she explained carefully. "Your species hasn't developed faster-than-light travel independently yet, so contact is strictly regulated. Most galactic citizens view humans as, well." "As what?" Jaren pressed, a sinking feeling in his stomach. "As promising but underdeveloped," Lyra finished diplomatically. "Something like intelligent children." Jaren felt his face flush with indignation. "We've split the atom, mapped our genome, and landed on our moon. We're hardly children. By galactic standards, those are kindergarten achievements," Lyra said gently. "But that's what makes you so fascinating. Your species accomplishes so much despite your limitations. Your adaptability, creativity, and determination are unmatched." Before Jaren could respond, a deep, resonant voice interrupted them. "So, the rumors are true. You've acquired a human specimen." Heading: A Hostile Encounter. They turned to find a tall, imposing figure regarding them with cold interest. His skin was a metallic blue-gray, with ridges running along his hairless skull. His eyes, 4 of them, arranged in a diamond pattern, blinked independently as they focused on Jaren. "Professor Valen," Lyra acknowledged, her posture stiffening. "This is Jaren Holt. He's participating in my research voluntarily." "Fascinating," Valen said, circling Jaren like a predator. "Such primitive physiology, yet surprisingly robust. The musculature suggests regular physical training." "I'm standing right here," Jaren growled, "and I can understand every word you're saying." Valen's upper eyes widened slightly. "It speaks with remarkable coherence. Tanari, you've outdone yourself." Perhaps your research might be salvageable after all. Lyra's red skin darkened with what Jaren guessed was the equivalent of a blush. My research methodology has been approved by the Ethics Committee, Professor. Jaren is a research participant, not a specimen. Semantics, Valen dismissed. Human, would be interested in conducting some comparative physiological assessments. My laboratory is far better equipped than the student facilities. His name is Jaren, Lyra interjected firmly, and he's already committed to my research program. Valen's 4 eyes narrowed. Need I remind you, student Tanari, that as department head, I have priority access to all research subjects of significant scientific value? Jaren stepped forward, drawing himself to his full height, still a head shorter than Valen, but his military bearing made up for it. Need I remind you, Professor, that I'm not a lab rat to be passed around? I've agreed to work with Lyra, not you. The alien professor regarded Jaren with newfound interest. Remarkable. Such territorial aggression despite being in an entirely unfamiliar environment. Perhaps there's something to your theories about human adaptability after all, Tanari. He turned to leave but not before adding, we'll discuss this further, student Tanari. My laboratory remains at your disposal, for now. As Valen departed, Jaren noticed Lyra trembling slightly. You okay? Professor Valen is influential, she said quietly. And not accustomed to being refused. Seems like a real charmer, Jaren observed. Lyra's translator must have captured the sentiment perfectly because she burst into melodious laughter. That's one way of putting it. Come on, let's continue the tour before we attract more attention. Heading, the campus tour. As they moved through the campus, Jaren became increasingly aware of the stares following them, some curious, some wary, some openly hostile. He'd been in enough combat zones to recognize when he was being sized up as a potential threat. Why do I get the feeling I'm not welcome here? He murmured to Lyra. It's not you specifically, she explained. Humans have a reputation. Your species' history is filled with remarkable achievements but also with conflict and aggression. Some more conservative species consider humans potentially dangerous. And what do you think? Jaren asked, suddenly curious about her perspective. Lyra's violet eyes met his, and something in her gaze made his pulse quicken. I think humans are fascinating. Your capacity for adaptation, for emotional connection, for overcoming impossible odds, it's unlike anything in the galaxy. Her hand brushed against his as they walked, the contact sending an unexpected jolt through his system. Her skin was warmer than a human's, with a texture like velvet. Sorry, she said quickly, withdrawing her hand. I forgot about human personal space protocols. It's fine, Jaren assured her, surprised to find he meant it. Cultural differences, right? Isn't that part of your research? Yes, Lyra confirmed, her silver hair catching the light as she nodded. Including physiological responses to various stimuli. Your heart rate just increased by approximately 20% from that brief contact. Jaren felt heat rise to his face. You can tell that? My species has naturally enhanced sensory perception, she explained. I can detect subtle changes in your body temperature, heart rate, pupil dilation. She trailed off, her own skin darkening slightly. Purely scientific observation, right? Jaren said, not entirely convinced. Purely scientific, Lyra replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. Heading, a growing connection. As they continued their tour, Jaren found himself increasingly drawn to Lyra's animated explanations and genuine enthusiasm. Despite his predicament, he couldn't help but be fascinated by this new world, and by her. When they finally returned to the dormitory, Lyra paused at the door. I've arranged for you to have your own quarters adjacent to mine. For research convenience, of course. Of course, Jaren echoed, a smile tugging at his lips despite everything. Rest well, Jaren Holt, Lyra said softly. And tomorrow, we begin the real research. Something in her tone made Jaren wonder exactly what that research might entail. Heading: A new day, new challenges. The next morning, Jaren awoke to the soft hum of the dormitory's environmental systems. The room was bathed in a gentle, artificial light that mimicked the sunrise on Earth. He stretched, feeling the strange, adaptive fabric of his clothing shift with his movements. It was still surreal, waking up in an alien university, surrounded by technology and species he couldn't have imagined just days ago. Lyra was waiting for him outside his quarters, her silver hair tied back in a sleek braid. She wore a more formal version of the adaptive bodysuit, this one in deep crimson with intricate silver patterns that seemed to shimmer as she moved. "Ready for your first day as a research participant?" she asked, her violet eyes sparkling with excitement. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jaren replied, though he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his gut. "What's on the agenda?" "Today, we'll be observing your adaptability in various academic and social settings," Lyra explained as they walked. "It's crucial to understand how humans process advanced concepts and interact with other species." Jaren raised an eyebrow. "You're not going to throw me into a room full of hostile aliens, are you?" Lyra laughed, the sound like wind chimes. "Not hostile, just curious. Most of the students here have never seen a human before. You're quite the novelty." Heading: The first test. Their first stop was a large, circular lecture hall filled with students of various species. The room buzzed with low chatter as Lyra led Jaren to a seat near the front. The professor, a tall, insectoid being with 6 limbs and compound eyes, clicked its mandibles excitedly as it noticed them. "Student Tanari," it said, its voice a series of clicks and whistles that Jaren's translator converted into smooth galactic common. "I see you've brought your human subject. Fascinating." "This is Jaren Holt," Lyra said, her tone firm. "He's participating voluntarily in my research." The professor's compound eyes gleamed. "Remarkable. Please, human, come forward. Today's lecture on comparative xenobiology seems particularly apparent. Would you be willing to demonstrate your species' respiratory system?" Jaren hesitated, glancing at Lyra. She gave him an encouraging nod. Stepping forward, he addressed the class. "Humans have a relatively simple respiratory system compared to some species, but it's highly efficient. We breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. Our lungs filter particulates, and our immune system targets foreign bodies." The room erupted in murmurs. The professor's mandibles clicked rapidly. A cogent observation. Perhaps the classification committee has underestimated human cognitive development. "Student Tanari, your research subject shows remarkable comprehension." Lyra beamed with pride, her hand briefly squeezing Jaren's thigh under the desk. The touch sent an electric current through him, and he caught her violet eyes widening slightly as she undoubtedly sensed his physiological response. "Sorry," she whispered, quickly removing her hand. "Cultural differences. Maybe we should discuss those differences more thoroughly," Jaren whispered back, surprising himself with his boldness. "For your research, of course," Lyra replied, her red skin darkening noticeably. Heading: The social experiment. The morning passed in a blur of classes, each more bizarre than the last. In theoretical physics, Jaren's primitive understanding of causality offered a refreshing perspective. In galactic history, his questions about human exclusion from interstellar politics sparked a heated debate. By lunchtime, Jaren had become something of a celebrity. Students crowded their table in the dining hall, peppering him with questions about Earth, human biology, and cultural practices. "Is it true humans only have 2 genders?" asked a gelatinous being that appeared to be constantly shifting between forms. "Do you really sleep horizontally for 8 hours every cycle?" inquired another. "Why do you cover your reproductive organs with fabric when they're not in use?" questioned a third. Jaren fielded the questions as best he could, alternately amused and mortified. Through it all, Lyra sat beside him, her thigh occasionally pressing against his, each contact sending waves of warmth through his body. "You're enjoying this," he accused her during a brief lull. "Immensely," she admitted, her violet eyes sparkling. "Your responses are providing invaluable data on human social adaptability." "Glad I could help," Jaren muttered, though he couldn't suppress a smile. Heading: the hostile seminar. Their afternoon, however, took a decidedly unpleasant turn when they arrived at Professor Valen's advanced xenopsychology seminar. The four-eyed professor's face remained impassive, but Jaren could sense his displeasure. "Student Tanari, human," Valen said as they entered. "How educational that you've joined us today." The seminar began innocuously enough, with Valen lecturing on cognitive development across species. But soon, his examples began to focus exclusively on primitive responses to stress, fear, and aggression, with pointed references to human history. "Consider the human tendency toward territorial violence," Valen said, activating a holographic display of Earth's major conflicts. "Their brief history is dominated by warfare, often over arbitrary geographical boundaries or ideological differences." Jaren felt his jaw tighten but remained silent. "Professor," Lyra interjected, "many developing species exhibit similar patterns before achieving social maturity. The Arcturian hegemony had 3 planetary civil wars before their renaissance." "Indeed," Valen conceded, though his tone was dismissive. "But they didn't possess nuclear capabilities during their aggressive phase. Perhaps we could examine the humans' responses to simulated threat scenarios. A practical demonstration would be most illuminating." Before Lyra could object, the room darkened, and holographic projections surrounded Jaren, snarling predators, explosions, weapons pointed directly at him. His military training kicked in instantly. He dropped into a defensive stance, muscles tensed for combat. "Fascinating," Valen observed clinically. "Note the immediate physiological preparation for violence, heart rate elevated, adrenaline spiking, pupils dilated." "Stop this," Lyra demanded, rising from her seat. "This wasn't approved by the ethics committee." "Merely a harmless demonstration," Valen replied smoothly as the holograms vanished. "The human was never in actual danger." Jaren straightened, controlling his breathing with effort. "Nice try, Professor, but I recognized those as projections immediately. My primitive brain can distinguish between real and simulated threats." A murmur ran through the class. Valen's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, the only indication of his annoyance. "Interesting. Perhaps next time, we'll try something more immersive." Heading: a moment of vulnerability. After class, Lyra pulled Jaren into an empty corridor, her expression troubled. "I'm so sorry. That was completely inappropriate." "He's trying to prove humans are dangerous," Jaren said. "To discredit your research." "Partly," Lyra admitted. "But I think he genuinely wants to study you himself. Your responses challenge theories about developmental psychology." Jaren leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. "Great. I'm a walking thesis contradiction." Lyra moved closer, her scent, cinnamon and ozone, enveloping him. "You're much more than that," she said softly. Her hand reached up to touch his face, fingers tracing his jawline with gentle curiosity. "Your responses today were remarkable." The air between them seemed to charge with electricity. Jaren found himself leaning into her touch, his own hand moving to the small of her back. "More research?" he asked, his voice husky. "Something like that," she whispered, her face tilting up toward his. The moment hung suspended between them, full of possibility, until a group of students rounded the corner, forcing them to step apart. "We should continue this discussion in private," Lyra said, her voice slightly breathless. "For thorough documentation." "I'm all for thorough research," Jaren replied, surprised at how much he meant it. Heading: A growing connection. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity for Jaren and Lyra. Between classes, research sessions, and the occasional run-in with Professor Valen, they found themselves growing closer. Their connection, initially rooted in scientific curiosity, had evolved into something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of tests and lectures, Lyra suggested they visit the university's recreation dome. "You've been working hard," she said, her violet eyes softening. "You deserve a break." Jaren raised an eyebrow. "Alien recreation? This should be interesting." Heading: The recreation dome. The recreation dome was a massive spherical chamber filled with various activities designed to cater to the diverse student body. Some students floated in zero-gravity chambers, while others engaged in what looked like a cross between chess and telekinesis. In the center of the dome was a swirling vortex of multicolored energy that pulsed rhythmically. "What's that?" Jaren asked, pointing to the vortex. "That's the harmonic confluence," Lyra explained. "It's a shared experiential matrix. Students use it to connect their neural patterns and share thoughts, emotions, and experiences." Jaren stared at the vortex, watching as a group of students seemingly melted into the energy field, their forms becoming translucent as they merged with the swirling colors. "Yeah, I think I'll pass on that one." Lyra laughed. "I thought you might say that. Come on, there's something more your speed." She led him to a zero-gravity chamber where students were bouncing off walls and each other in what looked like an elaborate game of three-dimensional tag. After a brief explanation of the rules, which seemed to involve capturing glowing orbs while avoiding being tagged by opponents, they entered the chamber. The sudden weightlessness was disorienting at first, but Jaren's military training in zero-gravity environments quickly kicked in. To Lyra's evident surprise, he adapted immediately, using controlled bursts from the propulsion units attached to his wrist to navigate the space with precision. "You've done this before," she accused playfully as he snagged an orb right from her grasp. "Something similar," he admitted, executing a perfect flip to avoid a charging tentacled student. "Part of standard space ops training." As the game progressed, Jaren found himself genuinely enjoying the competition. The alien students, initially wary, soon incorporated him fully into their play, shouting encouragement and good-natured taunts that his translator struggled to keep up with. Heading: A moment of intimacy. When they finally exited the chamber, breathless and laughing, Lyra's skin glowed with exertion, making her appear even more radiant than usual. "You continue to surprise me, Jaren Holt," she said, her voice low and intimate despite the crowded surroundings. "Your adaptability is remarkable." "Just wait until you see me dance," he quipped, though the idea of holding her close sent his pulse racing. "Dance?" Her eyes widened with interest. "Your species uses rhythmic movement as social bonding, among other things?" "Among other things," he replied with a wink. Before she could respond, a familiar cold voice interrupted them. "Student Tanari, human. How fortuitous to encounter you here." Heading: Professor Valen's ultimatum. Professor Valen stood before them, all four eyes focused intently on Jaren. Beside him hovered a small metallic sphere that emitted occasional beeps and clicks. "Professor," Lyra acknowledged stiffly. "We were just enjoying some recreational time." "Indeed," Valen said, his tone dripping with false pleasantry. "And how convenient that I should find you. The Ethics Committee has approved my request for comparative cognitive testing. Your human subject is required to participate in a standardized assessment tomorrow morning." Jaren crossed his arms. "And if I refuse?" "Then Student Tanari's research authorization would unfortunately be subject to review," Valen replied smoothly. "After all, if you're unwilling to participate in standard university protocols, questions might arise about the voluntary nature of your overall participation." Lyra's hand found Jaren's arm, her touch a silent warning. "What kind of testing are we talking about, Professor?" "Nothing invasive," Valen assured them. "The metallic sphere here will administer the test in my laboratory. My assistant, if you will." "I want to be present," Lyra insisted. "That would invalidate the results," Valen countered. "But you may observe remotely, of course." After the professor departed, Jaren turned to Lyra. "He's up to something." "Definitely," she agreed, her brow furrowed with concern. "But we don't have much choice. If he revokes my research authorization, you could be placed in quarantine pending diplomatic processing." Jaren ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "So we play along but stay alert." "Yes," Lyra nodded. Then she hesitated. "There is something that might help, a way to prepare you for whatever test he's planning." "I'm listening." "My species has a particular ability," she explained. "We can create a temporary neural link. It would allow me to share information directly, help you understand what to expect from various testing methodologies." "You want to link our minds?" Jaren asked, both intrigued and apprehensive. "It's not full telepathy," she clarified quickly. "More like sharing a dream space where information can be exchanged. It requires physical contact and mutual consent." The implications hung between them, charged with possibilities beyond mere information exchange. "Would it help me beat whatever game Valen is playing?" Jaren asked finally. "I believe so," Lyra said. "And it would provide exceptional data for my research on human neuroplasticity." Jaren smiled. "Always the scientist." "Not always," she replied softly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his breath catch. Heading: The Neural Link. They returned to Lyra's quarters, the atmosphere between them shifting from playful to something deeper, more charged. The room seemed smaller somehow, more intimate, as she dimmed the lights and gestured for him to sit on the edge of her bed. "This requires close proximity," she explained, settling beside him, their thighs touching. "And complete openness." "How close are we talking?" Jaren asked, his voice rougher than intended. In answer, Lyra took his hand in hers, guiding them to rest on either side of her face. Her skin was warm, almost hot to the touch, and incredibly soft. "Like this," she whispered, placing her own hands against his temples. "Now, close your eyes and focus on my voice." Jaren complied, acutely aware of her breath mingling with his, the subtle scent of her skin enveloping him. "Open your mind to me, Jaren," she murmured, her forehead gently pressing against his. "Let me in." What followed was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, a rush of sensation as her consciousness brushed against his, tentative at first, then more boldly. Images flowed between them, his memories of Earth, her childhood on a world with twin suns, his military training, her academic pursuits. And beneath it all, unmistakable currents of desire, his for her, and to his surprise and delight, hers for him. Their mutual attraction, laid bare in this shared mental space, impossible to hide or deny. When they finally separated, both were breathing heavily, their faces flushed with more than just the exertion of the mental link. "That was unexpected," Jeremy began, struggling to find words. "Unexpected," Lyra finished, her violet eyes wide with wonder. "I've never experienced such compatibility before." Their faces remained close, the air between them electric with possibility. This time, there was no interruption, no hesitation, just the inevitable gravitational pull of two bodies meant to collide.